Okay, the floor is okay.
Hello, everyone. This was totally an absolute betrayal. Oh my gosh, because I wasn't going to make the program. I
You were from the beginning.
This really is Alex Jana's session, because they are the ones as well who have the perspective of practice and coming from the as we're going to see, as different subjects. As you know, I am an international human rights lawyer, and I'm going to bring you the perspective of international human rights and how the public procurement intersects with international human rights, and how actually, there is this a real conceptual clash that we are trying to resolve, and some of the projects specifically are looking into this. So I'll try to keep it short. Some of you in the summer, I think I referred to some of you to the TED talk that I did, TEDx. No, that's not. TEDx talk that I did. So some of the content is developed, or maybe some of the images you would have seen already. So. Doesn't work.
The program yesterday, and what was it? Okay, so.
Okay. Good. Okay, so like an outline of what I'm talking about, and the main element here is to develop the state business network nexus. So when you hear about human rights and supply chains, when you hear about human rights and procurement, this is basically our theoretical and our legal hook is through the state business nexus. And we'll talk a little bit as procurement as a business and human rights issue, and specifically how or what is the main function of having business as a human rights issue is to, procurement as a human rights issue is to be able to demand public buyers to develop human rights due diligence in their supply chain. So, as we know, you know this perfectly. This is the the volume of procurement and its legal framework. And when I start this talk, I normally take us back to March 2020, when we saw these images that now we're going through. I think recovering the post-traumatic stress disorder that we all had from March 2020, and how suddenly public procurement stops in this nebulous thing for the public and society in general. Public procurement becomes a key function of the state to actually protect the lives and the health of its own citizens. I have some like really striking images. This was almost happening around this image of creativity in. And this is the image of hope. Is the first person in the UK that got the vaccine in NHS hospital. So I'll go back to this setting of March 2020. But first, you all as well know what are the primary aims and the secondary or horizontal aims, and how much we're fighting in sustainable public procurement to do away with the distinction between primary and secondary, and how much social considerations, in the UK we talk a lot about social value as well, have developed. But only recently we are equating social and social conditions with human rights as we understand it in international human rights law. So I also don't have to take you through the definition of public procurement as sustainable public procurement. But when we talk about sustainable public procurement and public procurement and human rights, we're really talking about two different things. Because obviously human rights is an aspect of public procurement, of sustainable public procurement, because it's part of the economic, environmental, social. But we're going beyond social aspects of public procurement, because as I will argue later, when we use the terminology, those that are working on human rights, we mean an obligation of the state. We're not talking about discretionary decisions of public buyers to introduce social conditions in their procurement. So human rights violations in global supply chains, we know that global supply chains are complex. We know that global supply chains are pose significant risks for human rights. And we know that public supply chains is the same as private supply chains. There is no distinction. The distinction is the ultimate consumer, in this case, is an institutional consumer. So we have some of the examples here of major human rights violations in supply chains that are all related to public procurement in some aspect, or in the procurement that the goods and services that public buyers acquire. So we have child labor and forced labor in the fishing industry. It was in the UK. There was some years ago an investigation that established that basically 100% of the seafood that was sold in sandwiches in Marks and Spencer's, the prawn mayonnaise sandwiches, they all came from Thailand. And Thailand, the Thai fishing industry has a high prevalence of forced labor and child labor, especially forced labor of Burmese migrants that get put in boats for 2 years in the high seas, and they're not allowed to get out or even work with no pay for 2 full years to fish the prawn sandwiches that they were eating at the university, for example. This is a picture of the Rana Plaza, which I'll leave the explanation for later. There's a picture of the Uzbekistan cotton fields. In Uzbekistan, the cotton fields are labored by the whole population in a state-sponsored forced labor. State gathers everyone in the cotton field, cotton picking up season, and everyone has to stop school, stop work, compulsorily having to pick up the cotton. Surgical instruments. There was a big scandal in the UK by the British Medical Association that uncovered that most of the surgical instruments that were used in the NHS were made in Pakistan, has a very long tradition of making surgical instruments, by children. And this is a photo of a dormitory in China from the Foxconn factory, in which in 2010, there's been a high significant amount of suicides due to the harsh labor conditions. And the companies, what they did, instead of changing the labor conditions, they put safety nets. So when the people jumping from the factories and from the dormitories fell, they didn't kill themselves. So, here's a photo of the factory making PPE, and how in one day over 1,000 workers tested positive for COVID, and they were bussed at night out of the factory. So while we were, this is November 2020, while we were demanding PPE from our governments, and masks and surgical and medical equipment, workers were trapped in factories, getting infected or being dismissed. This is the same day out of the factories while the whole supply chains collapse. So this is factories evidence that there is a link between public procurement and human rights. How do we make this legal link in international human rights? So we make it through the state business nexus. So the state, as an international law actor, has the obligation to protect human rights, and has the obligation to protect human rights against intromissions, against violations of its own entities and third parties, so corporations as well. But it has the obligation, the United Nations Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights established this state business nexus in which it established that they had the obligation to protect human rights in all its activities, including commercial activities. So commercial activities, when the state acts as an economic actor, also has an obligation to continue to protect human rights. And this is the case of public procurement. So we have the principles in the UN Guiding Principle, and as well the UN Guiding Principle call for policy coherence. We can't be demanding the protection of human rights from corporations when we're not demanding that when we act as the state acts as an economic actor, doesn't do the same. This the article-specific principle of the UN Guiding Principles that determines defines the state business nexus with regards to public procurement. We know as well, you know this perfectly, about Sustainable Development Goals and the role of public procurement there as well. But what happens with when we're trying to define the state as a buyer? So when the state, we define this, you know, at some point contradictory functions that the state have that are much more evident when you put the two legal systems next to each other. So when you put the public procurement legal system and you establish its aims, we know primary and horizontal, we have obviously efficiency, value for money, non-discrimination, open competition. Then we have other policy objectives. We're talking about policy objectives, which means to some extent discretionary or to the ability and capacity of the state. However, in international law, we're talking about international human rights law, we're talking about a legal obligation. So if the state doesn't protect human rights in its supply chain, it's defaulting on international law. However, if the state or public buyer doesn't comply with these principles, is defaulting on public procurement law. So we have a clash of two legal systems there, and we need to understand how to resolve it. So we have attempted a definition of what is public procurement from a human rights point of view. So it's the state and contracting authorities having not just a discretionary capacity to protect human rights, but a legally based duty to do so. So when Marisol, for example, sorry to pick on you, Marisol is the responsible procurement officer at the London University Purchasing Consortium. When the London University Purchasing Consortium is thinking about what to do to comply with its obligations under the UK Modern Slavery Act, they're not doing it only out of their own policy objectives of preventing forced labor in their supply chain. I argue that from a human rights point of view, they're doing it because as an entity, as an organ of the state, they have an obligation, a legal obligation. And if they don't, the UK will be defaulting in its international legal obligations. This is what public human from a human rights, business human rights law lens give us. You know, going beyond the discretionary. We've attempted, a colleague and I attempted a definition of public procurement, what this is beyond buying social. So it's understood that public procurement has to be understood as procurement that respects human rights and action and responsible business conduct through practicing supply chain due diligence. So when a public buyer procures, they have to identify, prevent, mitigate, and remedy the potential and actual adverse impact on human rights and environmental law that their procurement decisions bring. So, so how do we see play out the public procurement as a business human rights issue played out in the different actors that are involved in the public procurement the process? So we demanding human rights due diligence part of the procurement process involves that contracting authorities exercise due diligence. So before taking a decision as to what to buy and how to buy it and where to buy it from or who to buy it from, you need to establish this process of identification of what are the risks for humans, for labor rights in your supply chain. You have to establish specific contractual obligations that allow you to implement and develop this due diligence and establish meaningful consequences for the violations. Suppliers need to have, in turn, need to have their own due diligence process to understand their own impact on human rights, because that goes back to the impact that the public buyer decision produces, and they have to exercise due diligence and report back to the contracting authorities. And this, for example, contract managers do, and Marisol, then later at the end we can talk a little bit maybe about how you do LUPC about it when we finish this. Sorry to put you in the spot, I didn't tell you. But, and stakeholders need to be part of monitoring and due diligence, and this is civil society, and this is what we do with, for example, Electronics Watch. Some of you, and you heard them yesterday, making them part of the due diligence process in the supply chain. There's already significant advance at international level. We have the principles to guide government action to combat human trafficking in global supply chain by the very pretty name of the 5 Eyes. Countries that have signed these principles, in which they pledge to undertake due diligence to prevent, mitigate, and remedy human trafficking in their supply chains. We have international, national, and public bodies. The OSCE has produced a guidance on how to prevent modern human trafficking in the supply chain. The Australian Modern Slavery Act, actually, the Anti-Slavery Commissioner of the Australian Modern Slavery Act in New South Wales has the power to demand public buyers to exercise due diligence to prevent modern slavery in supply chains. We have lots of examples of which you know many, and my slides are gone. But I just wanted to leave this. I hope, Agatha, this is a good setting of the scene. And now I'm going to pass the floor to my esteemed colleague. Thank you very much.
Thank